So, my name is Bear, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what it means to make your API and interacting with it delightful. So, who am I? I'm currently leading up developer relations at Slack. Before that, I spent 2.5 years at Twitter working on our mobile product Fabric, or you may be familiar with Crashlytics, and also our data product Gnip. Before that, I was at Facebook for a couple of years, and before that, I was at a small startup called Strobe that spent a lot of time building up the community around a JavaScript project that lives on today as Ember.js. So I've worked with communities of different sizes, with products of different levels of developer love, and there are a few things that I've learned along the way that I would like to share with you. So how many of you in here remember the first time you deployed to Heroku? Really, only a few hands? But do you remember that magic, for those of you who did it the first time? It's just like you had to create something really quickly just by running Heroku install and then Heroku create, and all of a sudden you had this app that was up and running. It was configured for you. It was visible on the web. It was amazing and it was magical. And that magic is something that bought Heroku a lot of love and a lot of loyalty early on, so that when it came time for them to expand beyond Ruby and into other languages, people were so excited that Heroku was finally available for them in the kind of stack that they wanted to work on. So there are benefits that you get when you invest in going beyond the basics to really get at delight for your end users. And it's something that in engineering, especially when we're talking about API engineering, we sometimes take for granted or don't really think about, because we think that our users are too sophisticated for that. They don't need delight, they don't need magic, they just want something that works and works consistently and is stable, and that's enough. And to a certain degree, that's true. But there are things that you get when you invest in going above and beyond to really hit delight. So delight is sort of a metric of quality overall, and it affects everything. It affects everything from people's ability to adopt you, and that's both ability and interest in using your technology. It affects their success rate of integration. If they try and they fail, do they stop, or do they keep on going because they have some confidence that this is going to be a useful product for them to keep on working with? It affects customer satisfaction, which is in turn a big thing for retention. And it also affects people's willingness to promote your technology. If there's just kind of a fine API that you're using that's totally serviceable, if someone asks you about it, you might be like, yeah, that's fine. I totally use it, and it's been working for me. But if something goes and delights you, you're more likely to become an advocate without it being hokey. It doesn't have to be like we pay our customers to be our evangelists or any sort of weird interaction there. It's just they like it so much that they want to talk about it. And again, that all turns into things that keep your customers happy and coming back. So when we're thinking about designing APIs, there are a few critical moments in the user journey of using your API that are the moments when you can really capture people and get them excited and give them that moment of delight. There are a few key moments. The first, obviously, is onboarding, when they first join for the first time. How easy is it to download anything that they might need? How easy is it to configure? Are there any checkpoints along the way where you give them some happy, shiny vision of success? Then there's the daily use. This is sort of the trough middle where you can still find moments to surprise and delight people, even though it's not the splashy first-time interaction that they have. And then the last piece that I wish more companies spent more time on is how to delight even when something is going wrong. So I'm going to actually spend a decent portion of time talking about that, because that is the critical moment where you might lose somebody and where they have more faith in you if they've had any sort of delightful interaction, and they're more likely to stick around. So counterintuitively, let's start with the middle portion, daily use. What makes something good for daily use? Kevin Lacker, who was the CTO of Parse, where I worked a few years ago, had a great talk when he talked about what developers really want out of an API. And one of the things that made for a hilarious Fast Company headline was that developers want to be enabled to be lazy. Consistency means that if you don't know the name of an API, you can probably guess at it, because there's some sort of consistency in naming conventions, in where things are inside your data model, that people can figure out how to use it without being explicitly told, maybe even without reading your docs. This is something that can be easy to undervalue, because consistency is hard. Naming things is hard. And when you're building a brand new API and you're having to make the choice, do I decide to go with something that's consistent or maybe more intuitive for a brand new user? My personal recommendation is that you always stick with consistency, because even if you've got a lot of brand new users who are coming to something for the first time, if they always know the patterns that you're following, it doesn't matter whether it's slightly more intuitive to name something different if you're not bringing everybody along with you. So I'm a big proponent of consistency. Everything in this talk is pretty good fodder for argument, so please do argue back. You can tweet at me at BearDixit, you can talk among yourselves. But when we're talking about delight, people have a lot of opinions. It's pretty straightforward to have a simple API that does exactly what you expect. But when you delight people, often there's an element of magic, and some people hate magic. Some people love magic. Other people think that the more abstract something is, the more that you're not really sure what it's doing behind the scenes, the more they hate it. And so there's room for discussion here. But consistency, I'd argue it's one of those things that pretty much everyone wants. Kin just had a fantastic talk that included some information on the Open API and how there's so much more that you can do with it than just documentation. Open API allows you to do great auto-completion inside editors. You can do a lot of testing and mocking. It opens up whole worlds if you take the time to write a schema that conforms to the Open API spec. So it's something that we've done at Slack recently, and I think it's important to talk about the fact that when we wrote that, it was an initiative within developer relations, and it's not a prescriptive description of our API, it's a descriptive schema. And that is something that means that if you are not in the product team or you're not in the engineering team that builds this API, you can still enable your developer community, your API community, in a way that doesn't bind your engineering team to stick with the schema. Descriptive is A-OK, you can still build on top of it in really useful ways. The other thing that is a delight in everyday use is making things easy and fast. So there was a great talk by the team at Heroku a couple of days ago at DevXCon, where they talked about the power of a CLI to enable people to get tasks done more quickly and with just a few commands. Any of you who have been building for a long time, you know you have your keyboard shortcuts that make all the difference in your daily work. Tab completes make all the difference in your daily work. And so for things like Heroku CLI, making a CLI delightful was about figuring out the most common tasks and making them simple. Just a matter of a couple of clicks or a couple of keystrokes. And when you hit the true ease of use, the true speed of use, that's something that people will actually talk about for a long time. It was so fast. So onboarding is a slightly different kettle of fish. Onboarding is often the first interaction that people have with your API. They might have heard things about it in the market or from their friends, like, I really like using this API, or I really don't like using this API. They might have thumbed through your docs, but for the most part, the time when people really form their opinion is when they're onboarding for that first time. And so I want to talk about something a little bit controversial. Inside Fabric, or Crashlytics as it was prior to 2014, Crashlytics is a native mobile product that works with iOS and Android apps to capture crash information and then make that available in a dashboard so you can consume it and walk through your logs. Now on iOS, all information that's sent over about crashes needs a separate symbolication file so you can understand, you can map what the crash was to your lines of code. So what the Crashlytics team did was they built this funky installer app that was taking care of picking up those files, those DSIM files, on every single build and sending it over to Crashlytics so that they never had to ask you for it. You never had to go and upload things intentionally. It was part of the process. And then they thought, well, why can't we go a step further? Why would we have somebody have to jump out to our documentation to understand how to install this? Why would we have anybody need to go through a flow that we lay out on a web page? It should all be inside the IDE. So what they did was they built this Mac extension that lived in a long-running process up in your toolbar. And some people absolutely loved this. It made it super easy to drag and drop things into your Xcode project, and all of a sudden, everything worked by magic. You just had to click to copy something, paste it somewhere else, and there was no jumping around, no context switching. It drove other people insane. They were like, why does this have to be a long-running process on my Mac? Can't it just be something that happens every so often when I want it to happen? I'm a developer, I don't need this magic. I can copy paste and it's not a problem. So this was a sort of catalyst choice in the community, and it bought a lot of people's fandom, And it also bought a lot of people's contention and ire. So what my point is in telling you all of this is that whenever you're making choices about developer delight, you have to know that you're going to delight some people and you're going to drive others absolutely crazy. But the idea behind all of this was, can you make onboarding one step easier? If someone has to go through copy and pasting a few things, wouldn't it be nice if instead of all this, you had a package manager where you could just specify dependencies and every so often you pull down the latest version of the package and it would all be simple and easy. That's why people love things like NPM. It's easy and it's consistent and it takes one step out of having to think about all of this stuff. And so that's what we ended up doing with the Crashlytics dependency. Eventually, we released a CocoaPod because everyone pretty much wanted that as well. Another thing that's really helpful in onboarding is anytime you can reduce context switching, it's really helpful. If you've got setup instructions on one page, but then you have to go to a different page to actually configure your API key, and then you have to bounce back to the project that you're working on, and then you have to go back to referencing the first web page, it can be a lot to get people across the line when they're having to jump around like that. So anything you can do to bring that back in context is super, super helpful. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, is delight in failure. So things aren't always going to be rosy when people interact with your API. Sometimes things are going to go wrong. And there are a few things that I've seen around the web that I really like about how people deal with that failure. So the first example is from Stripe. They recently released a performance dashboard that you can look at if you've got a Stripe account. And what they call out is, if you've got any requests to Stripe that are failing, that you might not even be aware of, they give you a little heads up, and they also point you in the direction of where you need to go to fix that error. So think of this as error messages ++. Anytime you can make those error messages more informative, or better yet, send people toward a solution that enables them not to have to figure out what exactly it is you mean by your cryptic error, they can go ahead and fix it with your help. Another thing is whenever you can build in error handling in a way that suggests things, it's super helpful. So we released a tool recently inside Slack that helps people make API calls, test them out from inside Slack, and also you can reference docs based on top of the OpenAPI schema for our API. And if you don't know the name of the API method you're trying to call, we auto-suggest, did you mean this one? And people can go ahead and click through. So it's a lot easier for people to figure out not only I'm wrong, but here's a way that I can not be so wrong anymore. And the last piece, going back to this Fabric installer, you see this little yellow text at the bottom that says, it's been a while, reach out to us at support. How many of you have ever been psyched to be told that you need to talk to support? Yep, no one. And it's for a few reasons. One, humans take a while to answer things. You don't know if that support ticket is going to get answered in 15 minutes or 15 days. The other thing is that your inbound to support is almost always through something going either catastrophically wrong or mysteriously wrong in some way. And so one of the things that is a lot in your support team's hands, and is why I'm always a vocal advocate for getting high quality support, paying your support engineers, getting engineers on rotation, is because this is the moment where you really build customer empathy. What happens next after you're being pinged off into support? And it has a lot of components to do it well. The first is figuring out your voice and tone with your customers. It's very easy to adopt a brand voice that's stoic and, we're sorry to hear that something went wrong, we will get back to you shortly. That's what feels like the corporate black wall that makes people feel like, oh, maybe I'm not going to get a response for 15 days. This is a terrible experience. Investing some time in figuring out how to be friendly with your developers, or better yet, having this not be their first interaction with the support team. Maybe you've got a proactive developer relations team that's going out and building relationships before anything hits the fan. Taking the time to develop that rapport is super, super helpful for turning these moments around into delight. The next is to engage in actual dialogue. It can be really difficult when the people doing your developer support are not empowered to talk in real terms about what product change might look like. If somebody comes to you and has a feature request, and all you can do is say, thanks so much, log that as a feature request, see you never, it's going in a black hole. That's terrible, and that's honestly what a lot of people expect when they log a feature request. If you have people who you're telling, you know what, we want you to actually engage in dialogue with customers, figure out not just what it is that they're asking for, but the underlying need that is creating that particular request, that gives people a much better feeling in talking to your support team. It's not just a matter of ticking the box and saying, I pass this on to product, check. It's really understanding who are your customers. Taking that moment of failure to get a better understanding of who people are will always, always pay dividends. And it's also a moment to surprise and delight. Unfortunately, this program doesn't exist anymore, but there was a period when Starbucks had a partnership with Twitter where you could tweet people a coffee and they could just claim it as a Starbucks card. And so somebody tweeted out that they were up all night fixing bugs, and so I tweeted them a coffee. And it's a little thing. It costs like $3, but this person had a great experience because of it. And so when you get that extra factor of surprise together with delight, that's when you can turn customers who might have been disgruntled or tweeting angrily into your advocates. The last piece, and I realize this is very easy to preach now that I'm in a company that does this, is to be crystal clear about your follow-up and your follow-through. If people are coming to you after they've experienced something broken with your API, or they have well-qualified complaints, what are you doing with that information? You might be having an open dialogue through a GitHub issue where you're talking about the follow-up for what's happening with a fix, or maybe you're able to put up a product roadmap. For the Slack platform team keeps our product roadmap open on Trello, so anyone can look at it at any time. And at our developer events, we like to print a large-scale version of it and let people vote, upvote, add their own cards, and engage in that kind of dialogue. And the huge benefit here is that you get to have this actual conversation about what's happening next. All conversations are a lot more satisfying when you know that your problem or the thing that you raised isn't just going straight into the trash can, it's going up onto the roadmap. And again, I realize that I'm in a privileged position with a company that is willing to do this, but there are also a few ways that you can de-risk this if this is something you're interested in doing. The first is that you might notice that we just have general categories, near-term, mid-term, long-term. It doesn't commit to a particular date. And if you look at the language that we use, some of it is intentionally a tiny bit vague to de-risk the actual implementation details. This doesn't say things like, add a new endpoint under users that will allow people to do X. It says something more like, user to workspace app upgrade path, which leaves us room to implement without having to change that roadmap. So it's something that I think is a great practice. I recognize that it's not necessarily possible for all companies, but it is something that allows us as Slack to do more to delight and communicate with users. And the best part about it is that your team feels the delight dividends. One thing I didn't really touch on, but we've got a fantastic docs writer, Taylor Singletary at Episode, who has created a voice and tone for the Slack docs that people love. And when we go out and talk to people, they say, your API docs are so much fun. They have humor in them. They have a little bit of poetry. And feeling that warm fuzzies when you go out and talk to people is really huge. When your API engineering team goes out and talks to people and they're psyched about using the API rather than like, oh yeah, I have to use your API for work, it's fine. It's a big thing for both people being happy on the team, for retention if you're thinking about that as a manager. It's always worth it to invest. So thinking more broadly about it, quality affects all of these things, everything from user adoption to ultimate retention to even how your team is feeling on a daily basis. So it's worth taking time to invest in, and I am happy to talk about any of the controversial things about what actually constitutes delight. Thank you. So the big monitor tells me I've got about 5 minutes for questions. None. None of this was, yeah.
Is this presentation available anywhere?
I can put it up on SlideShare. Yeah, I haven't done it yet, but I can.
I have a customer success team, we should see it.
Oh, okay, yeah. I can also repeat it if I hear it.
When you're sharing the roadmaps and you say short term, medium term, and long term, especially when you're working with clients that are having a lot of pains and they want to have that a little earlier, the next question you're going to get from them is, tell me a little more, right?
Yeah.
How do you guys go about that? Like, what other level, like what will be the next level of saying, well, Q3, or are you giving like more, maybe between this range, or?
Yeah, so I usually get around that by not committing to a specific date, but telling them where in the conversation we are internally. So if they're asking me about a particular card, and maybe I can backtrack it here. So for here, this card, new display types, actually refers to a UI framework that we are releasing sometime in the fall. And if you ask me when in the fall, I can't honestly tell you this particular date or even this particular month, but what I can tell you is that we have recently gone through a huge naming convention workshop, and that we're finally nailing down the full spec for it. And it'll go into partner release in the next couple of weeks. So while that isn't a firm date, you can, as a person who's building on our API, understand how far along we are in the process and how much you can bank on whatever I'm talking about being a feature that is going to get released, that is going to be something you can rely on. So sometimes if I actually have a date like Q3, I'll share the quarter. If I don't even have that, I can tell you just like what level of conversation the team's having. Yeah.
So related to the same roadmap, public roadmap display, you know, there are times where you end up having to pull something off of the roadmap and put it back into the backlog again.
Yeah.
How do you guys handle that? And do you communicate when that happens, or does it just kind of disappear? And
That's a good question. We had to do that. We, for a long time, had a payments API in our long-term that has recently fell off because we wanted long-term to actually represent things that were even being conversed about rather than just perennial icebox. And we tell people when we update the roadmap, we don't release a diff. So we have yet to take off a feature that really drove people crazy. And the good thing about that is that it means we're relatively on track. We're not dismissing something that a lot of users want. But it also means that I don't have great advice for dealing with people who are very upset that you've removed a thing that they really want.
or advice for companies that routinely do that and end up having to communicate bad news? Right?
Yeah, I've had to do my fair share of communicating bad news. When I do that, it's usually centered around your mutual end user. Like we're removing this because it doesn't serve our mutual end customer, or if it truly is just the vagaries of corporate decision making, sometimes being honest about that really, really helps.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I'm going back a little bit to the last presentation and define, design, mock, and I guess so internally we have Scrum processes, and it's always kind of been you go design, you go build, and we'll talk later. And what's your process?
There are a lot of sub loops in the design and build portion where we have multiple layers of people who are building against the thing that we're going to release before we release it. So first is always internal. For that UI framework, for example, we had an internal hackathon where we invited people inside the company but not working on the platform team to come and hammer on it and tell us what they thought was unintuitive, counterintuitive, doesn't hold up beyond the design. Like in theory, the design looked great, but then when you actually built against it, had a bunch of inconsistencies or weirdness. And then you go back into the design phase a little bit, and then you rebuild. And then the next layer usually is a couple of partners, and usually we select partners rotating basis, and also based on who we think will do a good job hammering on it, and also will have enough patience to do that without getting disgruntled or losing patience, essentially. And then usually that gives us enough confidence to go to GA after a couple of sub-cycles like that. But I have worked at companies before where they like to have a limited developer release where you have to sign up and you get into a beta pool. And those are the people who you identify have more tolerance for getting buffeted around with small changes. But yeah. I think this is the last one because I'm down to 20 seconds.
You talked about recommending high-quality support people,
Yeah.
because that's a place where that touches customers all the time. In the past, how have you been able to convince internal management that that's a thing that should be sought?
That's a good question. Usually, it's by showing the difference between the response you get from users when somebody who's very informed versus someone who's only marginally informed has when dealing with customers. And you can make the argument showing, like I've had support interns, and without throwing them under the bus, they were in their teens, and they got a different response from people than the people who had been professionally doing this for 10 years. And when you're able to show that your community responds differently in a way that has long-term implications for your brand, for your adoption and everything, that can help you make that argument. Another thing that you can show, honestly, is productivity. If going through a customer request is trivial to you, you might be able to do 100 tickets a day. If every single one is you having to first go learn what on earth they're talking about, then go quiz 15 people on the engineering team to solve the ticket, and then get back to them, not only is that a drain overall on your engineering team who's helping you out, it also just means that you respond to fewer tickets. So you can make a very mercenary argument based on net results and the ratio of salary to expenditure to overall hours. And if that's the kind of environment you're in where you're really not able to sell the idea based on like, we want developers to love us because that's too fuzzy, you really can do the math out and make a numbers argument. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're psyched about developer support. I think it's important. And with that, I think that's me. But if you had any questions, you can tweet at me. I'm at BearDigsIt. I was once an archaeologist, and it was a hilarious joke at the time. And I'll post my slides as well. I'll tweet them out. So thank you.